All right, today's video is all about expansion. Now, so far in our dynamics processing series, all of the kinds of dynamics processing we've been talking about are forms of gain reduction. Whether it's downwards compression or upwards compression, it's still reducing the dynamic range. Expanders increase the dynamic range. So where upwards compression will make the quiet stuff louder, an expander will make the louder stuff louder, and downwards compression will make the loud stuff quieter, and downwards expansion will make the quieter stuff quieter. So expansion, whether it's upwards or downwards, is increasing the dynamic range either way. Now, the most common form of downwards expansion is a noise gate. In fact, modern downwards expansion is basically like an old school noise gate, but with more controls, a little bit more finesse. And upwards expansion is typically used to make transients louder. Transient shapers are essentially forms of upwards expansion, and they're designed to accent the transients and make them pop a little more. But there is a lot of other applications for upwards expansion, and there's a lot of other applications for downwards expansion than just noise gating. So today we're going to go through examples of upwards and downwards expansion and show you how to use them and give you some ideas of how they might be able to help you in your mix. So let's get into it. So expanders have similar controls to a compressor. The attack and the release work pretty much the same, but the threshold is kind of opposite. On downwards compression, everything above the threshold is being compressed, and on downwards expansion, everything below the threshold is being decreased. So we're going to start with downwards expansion. And like I said, it's pretty much a fancy noise gate. So listen to this noisy guitar, and when it's not playing, listen to the ringing of the amp and stuff in between the notes. That's a classic example of when you would want a noise gate. So let's take a listen to this guitar again, and then we'll bring the expander on. So you can hear all the noise has been taken out and the guitar is allowed to pass through. Perfect. That's just what you want from a noise gate. But like I said, the expander gives us a little more control. So let's take a look at that. Now, if I bring the range up too close to the threshold, listen to what happens. So it's not filtering out the noise. As I start to drop it down with a really fast release time, we'll get into that range where it starts to flutter a little bit, similar to what you can struggle with a noise gate. And you can hear that it's cutting in and out a little bit. So if you bring down the range far enough, it'll dip out all the way and it'll take that noise out. And let me turn the expander off again so you can hear this dry. And listen to the initial crack that comes in as the guitar plays, and you'll hear that little spike right as the guitar starts playing that's pretty harsh. With this really fast attack, it's pretty much leaving that untouched. But if I slow the attack down just a hair, now you can hear that the initial transient of the guitar when it comes in is really softened out. And if I take it up too far, the guitar seems to fade in. So all the way back now to super fast, here's 0.1 milliseconds. And at that speed, it almost makes the initial crack a little worse. So the handy thing about the attack on the expander here is if you dial it in just right, you can take the edge off of that spiky transient and smooth it out. So that was taken out a little too much, and that's 12 milliseconds. Let's go back to 7.5. That's pretty nice. And if we go all the way down to 4.5, yeah, that's about right. So again, we turn the expander off and listen to the attack on that guitar. And we'll turn it back on. Very nice. So we've totally cleaned up this guitar track. We've gotten rid of all the noise, and we've even taken a little bit of the edge off of that initial transient cracking out when the guitar starts playing. So this is just one example of how downward expansion is kind of like a noise gate with a little more control. It's super useful, but let's take a look at another example. So take a listen to the piano in this mix, and take a listen to how the pianist is letting the chords ring out. They have all of the sustain. So here we're going to use downward expansion for a little bit of sound design. You can use a downward expander to actually tame the decay or sustain of a sound. So for example, if I turn a noise gate on this piano, take a listen. See, you can hear the flutter of the noise gate as it tries to dampen the sound, and it would be hard to dial that noise gate in. It's way easier with an expander. So here's some downwards expansion set to just tame the decay on those piano chords. So to keep it sounding natural, you have to keep in mind the interplay between the release and the ratio and the range, because you can still get flutter from downwards expansion, but it does give you more control. And if I increase the threshold too high, it starts to cut off a little bit of the attack, even with the fastest attack time. So you still have to dial this in with a little finesse, but it does give you more control than just having a noise gate on here. And there we go. That's a nice smooth trimming of the decay there on the end of those piano notes. So there's lots of different uses for downward expansion. The most common way that you see it is on multiple microphones or you have multiple sources. A drum kit is a great example where you have a bleed over where you're picking up the hi-hat and say the top snare mic. You can use downward expansion to help filter the hi-hat out of that top snare mic. And other kinds of correlated material that you might see downwards expansion on would be anything done in parallel. If you're duplicating a sound onto multiple tracks, you can use expanders to trim certain areas of the duplicated sound. So, for example, you could use a duplicated kick drum and use the expander to get rid of the attack, thereby just leaving the thud of the kick and the decay to use that to fatten up your kick when you blend it back in parallel. So yeah, a lot of great uses for downward expansion. But now let's talk about upwards expansion. Upwards expansion is increasing the dynamic range of the louder stuff and making it even louder. And the most common case that you see that is in mastering, when a mastering engineer is trying to regain some dynamics from a mix that's been overcompressed, which is a big problem these days. People compress things so much that the mastering engineer will use some upwards expansion to try to actually get some transients back. It's also really great on a drum bus that may not be overcompressed, just to try to get a little bit more pop. So let's take a look at a couple of examples and put some upwards expansion on some things. So take a listen to this slap bass here that's dry with no processing on it. Now, a lot of dynamic EQs are able to go above the threshold, which is expansion. And now any signal that comes up to the threshold will get boosted even louder, which is not going to sound too great in this muddy range of 200 hertz, but let's take a listen. And I'll bypass the dynamics for you. So instead of doing that to the low, mid, muddy range, let's try to get the low notes of the slap bass around 100 hertz. This here is set at 110. And then the pops at the high mids range of the slap bass. Let's turn on some dynamics for those and see what we can do for this slap bass to get it to pop out. Engage our threshold a little more. And we'll bypass it. Back on. You can hone in on these specific regions and add this expansion into there to help those pop out whenever the information hits the threshold. And this can be a lot better than just using a static EQ to do boosts in this range, because it's only happening for a little bit instead of being on all the time. And also, unlike a static EQ, it increases dynamic range, like we said. So when something comes up to the threshold, it's pushed even louder, which is really helpful if you want to revitalize the dynamics of a sound. And this slap bass is a great example. Let's listen to it one more time, bypassed, and then we'll turn it back on. Yeah, Yeah, very nice. Let's take a look at some more uses for upwards expansion. So let's go back to our jam here and see what we can do on the drum bus to maybe get the snare to peek out a little bit more. All right, so this is 2K. And let's take a listen to more of the fundamental of the snare here. So let's apply some upwards expansion to these two frequencies in the drum bus to see if we can get the snare to pop out a little bit more. And I'll bypass it for you. And we'll make it a little more dramatic so it's a little easier to hear. We'll go a little overboard with it. If I crank the threshold here, you can see that there's no expansion going on anymore. Now we've just made a static EQ boost, because you don't want the threshold to be maxing out the range if you're still trying to get a dynamic increase. But if I back the threshold off and you can see the dancing there, what you're seeing is the softer snare hits are being boosted a little bit and the louder snare hits are being boosted even more. So this is how upward expansion works on a dynamic EQ. And it's really making the couple areas of that snare pop out. And like I said, it's a bit overdone, but this way we can really hear it. Let's bypass it again and turn the mix on. Let's go back and forth. And we're getting a little bit of ringing because we boosted a little too high with such narrow cues, so we're starting to get a little bit of that ringing effect. But this is another great use of upwards expansion. You can use it to simply accent things where you need to get some more dynamics going on and make things that are loud pop out even more. All right, let's take a listen to another drum bus. This is the one we used in the last video in upwards compression, where we were trying to accent the brushwork. So here, let's use the expander to actually try to noise gate out the brushes and do the opposite effect. Raise the threshold a little bit. And back the release off because we're getting a little bit of the fluttering effect. So you can see that we've cut out a whole bunch of that subtle brushwork. I'm going to bypass it for you and listen to the brushes come back in. Yeah, very nice. But let's turn that downward expander off the drum bus and do the opposite and bring in some upwards expansion on this drum bus. Here I have a nice big rise on the kick drum, since this kick drum in the bus is so soft. At 68 Hertz here, this is going to give a big fat boost to the kick. And then right up here at 2K, we're going to actually accent the snare and the drums a little bit. So this will be the opposite. We're doing upwards expansion now. I'll leave it bypassed and then we'll turn it on. Increase the threshold a little more on that snare drum. Bypass. Let's leave it bypassed and let's hear it in the mix. You can hear the bass drum and the snare has just been given a little bit of emphasis there, and it helps it pop out. But there you go. I just wanted to cover expanders in this dynamics processing series because they're really powerful tools. There's a lot of different applications where you could get really creative with an expander, upwards or downwards. You could really tweak reverbs and delays with side chains on expanders and create some really interesting effects. So if you don't have an expander, I highly suggest picking one up. And if you don't have a good dynamic EQ that offers upward expansion, this new version version that I was showing you of the PreSonus Pro Q3, they've updated this to offer upwards expansion. And also Nova by Tokyo Dawn, the free version does not do upwards expansion, but the Gentleman's Edition does do upwards expansion. And you can also get good upwards expansion from multi-band dynamics processors as well. Not all multi-band compressors only do downwards. A lot of them will also expand upwards. So all things to look into. But there you have it. I hope you liked it. I hope you know a lot more now about expansion and what it can do for you, and you get some creative ideas about how you could use it. So let me know in the comments what you think, and I'll catch you on the next one.